Again, my name is Mike Metro, and I do have the pleasure of being an elder serving you here at Faith Community Church. And for those who don't know, I spent 40 years in America's Fire Service, 35 of those years in Los Angeles County Fire Department. And you don't do a job like that without it impacting you in many, many ways. And the job had many impacts on me. And if you haven't had an experience like this, you will. An experience in your life, something that you experience where it changes your perspective. It changes your perspective on people, on life, on things, and it forever changes you in how you act in the future. And so what I want to do this evening is I want to share with you one of those experiences that I had that changed me forever. I was a fire captain on fire engine 117 out of East Lancaster. And a 90-year-old woman who had rolled on a lot changed me. She changed my perspective in a very interesting way. Oh, sorry, I'm behind. I gotta make sure I do this. Okay, again? Yeah. Okay. How many of you seen The Wizard of Oz? Okay, now I'm talking about the original one. Now, what happened at the end of the movie to the Wicked Witch of the West?
She melted.
She melted. How did she melt?
Because she got some water poured on her.
She got water poured on her. Okay, so that's what they want you to believe. But I'm here to tell you that's not what really happened to the Wicked Witch of the West, for I am convinced that she moved to a trailer park in East Lancaster. And this woman was the meanest woman I had ever seen. And she would call 911 for a medical problem probably 2 or 3 times a month. And it was our pain to minister to her. So we would oftentimes get these calls, and I tell you what, she lived in this old trailer park, and you would get there, would snake the fire engine through these narrow roadways, and would come up in front of our old trailer, and as soon as the diesel engine would rumble to a stop, we would hear her screaming at us from the top of her lungs. And usually how it would go is she'd be screaming at us as to why it took us so long to get there. And she had this crackly voice, kind of like the Wicked Witch of the West. Remember what she used to say about Dorothy and the dog Toto? How many can mimic her voice? Yeah, that's very good. Well done, man. Okay. I'm gonna get you and your little dog Toto too. And that's what her voice sounded like. And I tell you what, when she was initially screaming at us, she would be cussing at us using words, some of which I'd never heard of before. And she would cuss like a sailor. She truly would. So the context of her initial insults, again, she'd chastise us for being late. And as soon as we walked into her trailer, she would cuss at us about why the LA County Fire Department sent the ugliest firefighters to her side. And now, she wasn't joking. She would typically pick out some, turn to one of the firefighters and say something like, "Oh, your diet isn't working too good, is it?" I mean, she was mean. And so as soon as we entered her trailer, she would start complaining and yelling at us. And so generally we would just put up with her, and we would do our job and put her in the back of an ambulance and take her to the hospital. Now this particular day, it was a very bad day for her. And so again, as we pulled up, we could hear her screaming at us, as she always did. And then we walked her to her trailer. She would complain that they sent the ugliest firefighters in the world to her side. That was just normal, but this time was different. She was in an especially bad mood. And so one of my firefighters, his name was Darn. He was a big hulking guy, probably 6 foot 4 inches tall, probably 250 pounds. I mean, he was built like a brick outhouse. And he wrapped a blood pressure cuff around her arm. Now, she was 90 pounds with rocks in her pocket. I mean, she was a tiny thing. And so the firefighter wrapped the blood pressure cuff around her, and apparently he must have pumped it up just a little bit too tight, for she slapped him across the shoulder, and the slap resonated throughout the room. And this big hulking firefighter, I've known him for years, he looked at me, he's like, "Dad, make her stop." I looked at him and said, "Dude, she's 90 pounds. What's she gonna do to you?" So that just gives you an example, sets a stage for how she was going to treat us on that particular day. Okay, next slide. So, I'm sorry, back up. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. So, again, we went through our assessment. I canceled the paramedic squad that was dispatched to us, for all she needed was just a ride to the hospital. And so here the four of us were in her living room, and as the captain, I was responsible for documenting, her vitals and the chief complaint and all that kind of stuff with her. And the crew was picking up the vitals and hooking up an EKG machine to her and seeing what her heart rhythm looked like. Now she did something that she had never done before. She looked at me and he said, "What is your name?" I thought, oh, we're making progress. She's doing something personal. She's trying to be nice. And so I kind of put my shoulders back and puffed my chest out, and I says, "Ma'am, my name is Metro, Mike Metro." She looked at me with a sideways look at me, and she said, "Metro? That's a stupid name. Sounds like a bus company." Okay. So again, we went on our way. Now, my firefighters, the three of them, there's four of us total, three of them, I went back to doing what I was doing, finishing the report, and what I didn't know is my three firefighters were gathering up their equipment, and under the guise of taking it back out to the fire engine, they snuck out and left me alone with the wicked witch of the West. And there was a big picture window in the front of her trailer, and so I was looking out, I could see the fire engine, and my firefighters were standing on the other side of the rig, on the running board, peeking above the hose bed like this. And they had this weird looking grin on their face. And I looked at them from the window, I said, "Get back in here." And this weird looking smile. Well, the wicked witch of the West knew she had me. And I heard her say, "Cowards." I said, "What'd you say?" She said, "Oh, they're a bunch of cowards leaving you alone with me." And I thought, oh my gosh, she's going to bring out a voodoo doll or something, start putting needles into it. So I tell you, and this was terrible, but in a desperate attempt not to make contact with her, just to try to find anything so I wouldn't have to deal with her. I looked at my medical report, and I thought, okay, there's got to be something I'm missing here, just so I could devote my attention to that. And tell you, it was the best medical report I've ever written. And so in a desperate attempt first off, my only salvation at this point in time was for the ambulance to get there and for the attendant to come in, put her on the gurney, and load her in the ambulance. So I grabbed my radio off my belt and I says, "LA, engine 117, would you give me an ETA for my ambulance?" And the dispatcher came back, and her voice echoed in the room, and he said, "Engine 117, LA, your ambulance is broken down. Your next ambulance is at least 15 minutes away." Holy cow. I looked at my watch, and it seemed like my watch just stopped. I saw a clock on her wall with a second hand, and the second hand was going click, click. And again, in a desperate attempt to look at something, find something that would draw my attention, not have to engage in her, I saw a picture on a table. I never saw the picture before. And it was a picture of a young man in an army uniform, World War II, and a woman in a wedding gown with a smile that lit up the entire picture. Now, she could tell that picture got my attention. And she said, "That was my husband." And I regret these words. I said, "You were married?" That got me a whole string of cuss words again. But nonetheless, she asked me to bring the picture over to her, and I sat next to her on her couch. And she held this picture with both hands like she was cradling a precious gift. And I looked at her face, and the hardness of her face seemed to dissolve away. And I looked at her eyes, and she seemed to be transported back to a different time, a happier time that probably was 50 years previous. And as she stared at the picture, again, the hardness seemed to be dissolving in front of my eyes. And she explained to me that during World War II, she had married a man, the love of her life. But however, World War II was being battled in Europe and in Asia. And so her husband wanted to protect the United States of America. He wanted to sign up to serve this great nation and protect our freedoms. And he was so excited to do that. But he says, when I get back from the Army, we will start our life together. Now, as it came close towards the end of his enlistment, he told her, he says, honey, I'm coming home real soon, and we'll start a family, but I have one last big job to do. Now, for you historians, the big job was D-Day. Probably one of the largest military actions in the history of mankind. And she shared with me, with tears in her eyes, that on that day her husband died on a beach called Normandy. As she shared her story, I was immediately drawn into her life. I asked her if she ever remarried again, for which she replied, no, he was the only man for me. He was the love of my life. And I asked her if she ever had any children. And with a twinkle in her eye, she said, yes, I had thousands. For she threw her life into teaching kids. And she explained to me that each one of her kids was precious to her. And so she said she had thousands of children. And she taught for decades until her health got the better of her. Now finally the ambulance showed up. Time seemed to go by in an instant as I was sharing her life and finding out her story. I was sad that the ambulance came. Now they put her on the gurney, and before they loaded her in the back of the vehicle, she grabbed my hand and she said, thank you for hearing my story. And I tell you, the look on my firefighters' faces was priceless. I learned something that day. On the ride back to the fire station and the fire engine, I'm sure my guys were trying to talk to me, but I kept gazing out the window, the windshield of the fire truck, deep in thought about a life that I wanted to know more about. I got off duty the next morning, and when I returned to work 24 hours later, the captain who I was relieving, his name was Mike as well, typically we share information about significant happenings of the previous shift. And he said, yeah, we rolled on the Wicked Witch of the West again. He says, but it was kind of interesting. She asked me where the guy with the name was who sounded like a bus. He said, do you know what she was talking about? And I just smiled and didn't say anything. We ran on her several more times after that, and wasn't too long, several weeks later, Teresa and I and the kids went on vacation. When I came back, I found out that she had died. And I was sad. I can only imagine that that was a very lonely funeral. And I wish I could have been there. But she taught me a very, very important lesson that I remember to this day. That everyone has a story. Sometimes that story is happy, sometimes sad, oftentimes a combination of both. But everybody had a story. Even the Wicked Witch of the West, who I found out really wasn't as wicked as I thought. And she taught me a lesson for which I am eternally grateful for. So how did it impact my life? Well, I'll tell you one area is it brought to mind the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, how many of you remember the story of the Good Samaritan? Probably most of you do. And it was the story is in Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. And it tells of a man who was traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, you're actually traveling down a mountainside, and you descended about 3,300 feet. And it was a pretty wide road. I mean, there was wagons or wheeled vehicles with horses drawn, there were mules drawing on that would go down this way. But it was treacherous. And there was robbers that would hang out and oftentimes attack people and rob them. So again, it was notorious for being beset by thieves. So let me read you the passage. I want you to pay attention to a couple of important things. So this conversation is occurring between a lawyer and Jesus Christ. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, Jesus, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he, Jesus, said to him, What is written in the law? What is your reading of it? So he, the lawyer, answered and said, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said to him, you have answered rightly. Do this and you will live. But the lawyer, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? Then Jesus answered and said, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a certain priest came down that road. And when the priest saw him, he passed by on the other side of the road. Now, so let's see. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the same place, came and looked, and he too passed by on the other side of the road. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion for him. So he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring in oil and wine on the wounds, and set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, take care of him, and whatever you need, whatever more you have to spend, when I come again, I will repay you. So Jesus asked, so which of the 3 do you think was a neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? And the lawyer said, he who showed mercy to him. Then Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. Now, understand, you got this. Traveler was attacked, robbed, and beaten, and left for dead. No doubt he was bloody. And a priest walked by and didn't even stop. And again, he went to the other side of the road. It's like walking across a major street in Santa Clarita, and so you cross to the other side of the road just so you wouldn't have to engage the person who was wounded. The priest walked by, didn't stop. Levite, who assisted the priest in the work of the temple, saw the injured man as well, tried to walk by him, and again, he ignored him. So now I want to do a little role play. Jillian, come on up. So now Jillian is going to play the part of the wounded Jewish person. Okay. So tell you what, you can sit here, or whatever. Now you got to play the part, right? Yes. Okay, you're hurt. You're hurt bad. All right. So here I come. I'm either the priest or the Levite. Doesn't matter. So I come walking in, and I see her. And not only do I just walk by her and not even see her, but I walk across the road. I walk over here because I want to avoid her. Okay? So here I go. I'm ignoring her. I don't want to see her. She's still laying there. What is she thinking? Jillian.
Oh, hey!
No, Jillian, you forget the other part.
Hi!
She's supposed to say, hey, I'm here. Come help me. Okay. You get a B minus. But the point is I had to go out of my way to ignore her. I had to go out of my way not to help her. Now, does that kind of sound a little familiar to how I was doing with the Wicked Witch of the West? How I would do anything just not to engage in her, not to engage with her? I mean, we did our job. You know, whatever medication she would need, we did our job and we took her to the hospital. But the point is oftentimes when we see somebody hurting, is we tend to ignore them. People who are hurting, oftentimes they cry out, but with no words. And you see them. You see the sadness. You see sometimes the downtrodden. You recognize them. We all do. Now finally a Samaritan came on the scene and he stopped. He applied wine to his wounds, which acted as antiseptic, and olive oil, which is soothing and healing. He placed him on his animal and took him to the inn, which is like a hotel. And the Samaritan gave the innkeeper the equivalent of 2 days of wages to cover the man's lodging and care, with the promise that if it cost more, that he'd be back to repay the man and take care of the bill. So for the Samaritan, it took effort to stop and help. It cost him money to stop and help the man. It cost him time to carry this man to the end. And it took eyes to see. So what did I learn? Again, I learned that everyone has a story. Again, it may be a sad story, maybe a happy, maybe a combination of both, but we, all of us in this room, and those that you know, have a story. And I learned the importance of treating people on the basis of that. Now, I've talked here, shared with you a couple times, and there's a picture of my brother. My brother's the guy on the right that looks like Willie Nelson. And many of you remember his story. And my brother, in his older years, struggled with alcohol and drug abuse, and he was homeless for a good chunk of his life. And 2 weeks before he died, the Ventura County Fire Department responded to my brother when he began to get very, very sick. Now, it would have been very easy for them just to throw him in the back of the ambulance and not really care. But they treated him as if my brother had a story. And he did. He was taken to Ventura County Hospital, and they too treated my brother like he had a story. They treated him like he had a mom that loved him, a dad that loved him, a brother that loved him. When Jeff took a turn for the worse and he went into a coma, I didn't know that he had been picked up at this time. The hospital staff went to extraordinary lengths to try to find me. My brother had my number down, but he transposed one number off of my cell phone. But the hospital nurse remembered that Jeff said, my brother works for Los Angeles Fire Department. Now there's Los Angeles City Fire Department, there's Los Angeles County Fire Department. So the hospital went to the trouble, they called the LA City Fire Department and said, we're looking for Mike Metro. And he said, well, he doesn't work here, but we know where he works. And so they hooked me up with him, and I was able to spend the last week of my brother's life before he died, because the Ventura County Hospital cared enough to know Jeff's story. And now 13 years later, I'm still thankful for what they did. So now, how does this apply to you? I think you figured out how it applies to me. Now, as a church leadership team, we have talked a lot about loving your neighbor in these times. How can we practically do that? I want to talk about how you can practically do that. Are you a person with eyes to see? I'm going to read to you Luke 7, chapter 7, verse 11 through 15. Now it happened the day after that he went to a city, Jesus, went to a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, along with a large crowd. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. And he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, young man, I say to you, arise. So he who was dead sat up and began to speak, and he presented him to his mother. I tell you, in a situation like this, there was a large crowd. That could have been Jesus' attention. There was a dead guy in a box. Well, that could have been Jesus' attention. But what did Jesus see? This is in Pastor Jackson's sermon a couple of months ago. What did Jesus see? Come on. A hurting woman. Absolutely. She had only one son. The son helped support her. She was a widow, didn't have a husband to support her. So, I mean, there was a great burden. But Jesus not only saw her, but he saw her story. And this is something really significant. So, again, note the Lord saw her. Many things could get his attention, but it didn't. Jesus had eyes to see. Okay, I'm going to call Jared and Eric up. And as you're walking up, Jared is going to play the part of a teenager who his parents have moved. Why are you laughing about that? What, did you look up one? That was not right.
I'm a teenager now. Hello, youth.
So his parents just dumped him, escorted him down the hall, and he's saying, I don't want to go. I don't know anybody in there. I don't want to go. And so now Jared, you already messed up. So you got to come through that door. Your parents should force you through this door. Okay? Now, Eric and I are good friends, okay? And we hang out a lot together, you know, so we're good friends. All right, so here, oh, hi.
Hey. Jared.
Uh,
Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you too.
Strong hand. Yeah, good to meet you.
Yeah. Hey, dude, how was that monkey movie you saw the other day? Was it Godzilla or something? Was that pretty good?
Oh, yeah, we got Zilla King Kong, yeah.
Yeah.
It's fabulous. You gotta go check it
Oh,
out.
I know. Yeah. And what's with the Dodgers?
Yeah, they're both in so bad right
Oh,
now.
yeah, I'm supposed to be wearing a hat. Are you wearing a hat? Warning?
No, I think
All right. Okay. Would you step, move out of the chair for a second? I'm gonna sit with my buddy. All right. So let's hang out here. And just, you know, see how things go. All right. I didn't get kicked out. All right. Good job. Now, this is, it may sound a little bit silly, but this is very important. What did I miss? What was that?
You missed interacting with Jared.
I missed interacting with Jared. What else did I miss? What's that? Getting to know him, absolutely.
Realizing he was alone.
Realizing he was alone, that was huge. What else? I missed his story. I missed Jared's story. Did I see him? I saw him visually, but did I see him? Like Christ saw that widow, did I see Jared? No, I didn't. No, I was hanging out with my buddy Eric. And so, I mean, can you imagine walking into a new church? You don't know anybody. Your parents moved you here from out of the area, out of the state, doesn't matter. And you walk in by yourself and you get that kind of a greeting. I mean, that's a check in the box greeting. Someone told me, hey, anybody walks in the door, it's your job to, you know, to shake their hand and introduce yourself. Got it. That's all I did. And so it's an opportunity to identify somebody's story. So what do you see? What do you see in your life? Do you see the popular person in school and wish you were them? Or do you see the unpopular? Do you see the social butterflies at school? Or do you see the sad and the lonely? Do you strive to understand their story? Some of you go to public school, some of you go to private Christian school, some of you go in homeschool. There's 3 different universes there, folks, with different pressures and different things that you experience, different problems, different stresses. Do you understand people's story in those 3 different universes? Does your heart go out to them? Do you see those struggling with a school subject that you could help with? Do you see those struggling with life? Do you see those kids whose parents are breaking up? Do you see those who have lost a loved one? Do you see those struggling with who they are? Do you see those struggling with their sexuality? Do you see those struggling with their sexual identity? Do you see those struggling with what they'll do in their life? Do you see those struggling with a relationship with God? Do you see those struggling with sin? Do you have eyes to see that? Do you try to seek out their story? I want you to look around the room. I want you to look around the room and say, do I know people's stories here? Do I really reach out to those who are new here? Do I really look at someone whose face looks a lot sadder than what it usually is and come alongside them and say, are you okay? Can I help? That's kind of scary, right? Because we think, well, if they say that something bad happened in their life, then I gotta say something, right? But you know, sometimes you don't. Sometimes all you have to do is see and listen. Sometimes that's all you have to do. And that will make a difference in someone's life. So these are some of the things that I learned from the Wicked Witch of the West. So what do you see? Or are you blind? The decision that you make is, will you ignore somebody that you know is hurting, like the priest and the Levite did? Or will you be like the Good Samaritan and stop and render aid? Will you search out those who are hurting? And when I say search out, I'm not talking about a cursory glance around the room and say who's hurting here. I'm talking about when you're going to work and you're late and you can't find your car keys and you're tearing apart the house trying to find it, and you go to the clothes you wore yesterday in the dirty clothes hamper and the couch, and you're tearing cushions apart trying to find your keys. I'm looking for that kind of search. That you need to search out people like that who need the love of Christ in their lives. How about your neighborhood? Is there an older couple who's been shut in since COVID started and they're lonely and scared? How about just dropping off a bag of cookies on their porch? Is there a widow or widower who is by themselves and lonely? Can you stop and render aid? When Teresa and I moved into our house in 2009, oftentimes it's way too easy to pull the car in the garage and hit the down button, and down goes the door, and then now you're encased in the bubble of your house, as opposed to leaving the garage door up and engaging in your neighborhood. And along with Pastor Steve's sermon on engaging in people and living life in your circle of living, Teresa and I began to realize that there's a woman down the street whose husband died of Alzheimer's a year or two ago, and we didn't know it. There was a guy whose wife died of breast cancer after being married for 35 years, and we didn't know it. And shame on us. But we need to search. We need to look for those kinds of ways that we can minister to people. How about your circle of friends, or maybe a person you know from school? Oftentimes rendering aid can be in the form of a text or a phone call, especially to somebody that you don't normally talk to. Sometimes. You can even be looking at old pictures. Now our time is almost over. I have a challenge for you. Now I know that within 24 to 48 hours, likely a lot of what you heard and learned here tonight, I hope you learned something here tonight, but it'll kind of get lost and blurred in the background clutter of life. And it may not be as important as it might be to you right now. So I'm asking you that when you go home tonight, you'll make a list of 3 people. 3 people that you normally don't reach out to. People who would be surprised and hopefully blessed by you reaching out. And whether that's a person at school, in your neighborhood, or a person you work with, it doesn't matter. I want you to write down 3 names. And I want you to commit to these following things with these 3 people. I want you to commit to see them. And now I hope you know what I mean by that. I want you to really see them. I want you to sit down and listen to their story, just like I listened to the story of the Wicked Witch of the West, and how it broke me into looking at life in a whole different way. Look for opportunities to love your neighbors as yourself. Now, is that a commandment that Jesus gave us? Let me think. Yes. At the end of the story about the Good Samaritan, that was a commandment that Jesus gave us to love our neighbors as ourselves. And I tell you, this can be scary. But in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 17, the Bible says, God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and a strong mind. So don't be afraid. And finally, remember that everyone has a story. You just have to find it. So go and find it. With eyes that see, a heart that feels, with hands of compassion, obeying Jesus' command regarding what the Good Samaritan did. That's my charge to you. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, one of the distinctives of a Christian is that we love each other. So Father, I pray that each one of us here tonight will make that commitment that we will reach out to 3 people, that we will see them as you saw the widow who was mourning the loss of her son. I pray, Father, that we will find out their story, as I found out the story of a woman who was really kind. Father, I pray that we'll have hands to minister, eyes to see, a heart with compassion. Father, I pray that each person here will do that. And at the end of that process, each of us will have a new friend. And I pray, Father, that each of us will have the courage to invite that new friend to church, to youth group. And to not be like Jared was, coming into a room by himself and being scared, but walking into a room arm in arm as two friends. So, Father, pray that we'll keep these commitments. We thank you for tonight. Thank you for the ministry here at Faith Community Church. All these things we ask in your precious Son's holy name. Amen. Now, before we split up, I don't know if there is or not, but any questions for me?
What do you do if you have like guilt, like you know you've done that?
So what do we do with the guilt? We know we've done that before. We've done what? Oh, ignored people. You know the best way to solve that problem? Don't do it again. And really, I'm not joking about that. But and if that person was hurt by what you did, the best thing to do is to go to that person and say, I'm sorry. I really am. And we just hang out. Does that answer your question? Okay. Other questions? You said good. This is life stuff, folks. And in your age, you're engaged in life. Other questions? Going once, going twice? Oh, sorry.
Talk to people and they're just like flat out rude.
Like the Wicked Witch of the West?
Yeah, that's how, like, how do you start a conversation with someone? They're just like flat out rude.
Yeah. You look for linkages. Like that picture of the Wicked Witch's husband and her in that wedding gown. That was a link to open up a conversation. And God gave that to me. I wasn't smart enough to figure that out. But look for those kind of linkages. It says, hey, I heard you're struggling in English. I'm good in English. Can I help you? That's an idea. But look for links. Look for commonalities where you can say, hey, I can help you in this area. Does that make sense? Other questions? Go once. Go. Yes. You ask really good questions. You really do.
Reaching out to someone that you might not reach out to might be considered awkward. Is there like ways to help avoid that, I guess?
Have courage. Memorize 2 Timothy 1:17. For God did not give us a spirit of timidity, He gave us a spirit of power. And it's a lot about just making a decision. I'm going to do it. I may get shunned. I may say, who are you? Buzz off. That might happen. You know what? So what? Just continue to reach out. Continue to seek. Continue to find people's stories. Other questions? Good. Anything else? All right, everybody, thank you very much. I always love hanging out and sharing with you. And if there's any questions you have after we dismiss, then hang around and I'll be glad to talk.